So I mean, for those who didn't get a proper introduction to Renza, he is in charge of the work and economy section at Cardus. There's a think tank which certainly covers faith in the public square and all its dimensions in Canada. And it's very much aligned with the history of the organization, because not everybody knows, people know the name Cardus, but not everybody knows that for many years it was known as the Work Research Foundation.
Have you heard of Cardus before?
Mm-hmm.
You have? Okay. And you?
No.
Okay.
Okay, so the office is in Hamilton, and now for about 10 years now in Ottawa. So reaching decision makers, but also reaching into the economies, people who, especially Christian trade unions, those who brought their faith into the workplace, use that as one of the bonds for upholding their Christian identity, and also strong tradition of reaching into Dutch Reform and Catholic ideas about how small community goods reach up into the common good. And we've heard a number of interesting narratives circled with different presentations today, and I think quite a few can come together in what Renza wants to start by talking about today, because we've talked about all these interesting and available communities in Canada. Father John was talking about that. We also learned about the principle of solidarity. We were given a lot of empirical data about how things could be measured and how a wide enough empirical window might be open to give findings that might be useful or persuasive to policymakers. And in a study that's just come out that Renza authored for Cardus, there's a little bit of a use case or a case study centered on the higher principles of subsidiarity, but looking at a specific problem with some fine granularity, which is the factors of success in onboarding refugees in Canada. So anything else needs to be said about Cardus?
No, I think that's great. Thanks, Miles.
Is it spelled C-A-R-D-U-S?
Because this is not really working well, I'll just give you a copy of it.
Exactly, the smart ones do it.
And exactly. So I'll just when I come to a couple of things that would be on the slide, I'll just draw your attention to what page it's on instead. As you can see, this may be for preliminaries. Just to add to what Miles said, Cardus is a think tank. So we write public policy reports ultimately so the governments will implement our ideas. But what makes us unique is that we're Christian. And so we use principles of Christian social thought, like subsidiarity and solidarity. So that's really what this report is about. So it draws on Catholic social teaching, and in particular, the principle of subsidiarity. So are you familiar with the principle of subsidiarity? Yes, good, okay. So one of the things that I'm trying to do with this report is to clarify some of the deeper meanings of subsidiarity that a lot of the time people don't pick up on. What I'm thinking of in particular, so usually when you say subsidiarity, most of the people out in the world have no idea what you're talking about. It's a 6-syllable word. Very vague, yes. And the other thing that people think about is it's about governance, right? They think it's about government, that it's about making sure that here, I'll give you one of these. The PowerPoint's not working, so I'm just gonna when I want to point out a graph or something, I'll bring it to you to the right page. But anyway, so they think it's about governments, and they think it's about how different levels of government, the province deals with healthcare and education, the municipal government deals with garbage collection and roads, and the federal government deals with national defense and currency. And that's true, obviously. That is part of what subsidiarity is. But the point I'm trying to make in this paper is that subsidiarity is a lot broader than that. That it is also about all these other institutions that exist outside of government, and that it's not fundamentally about efficiency and deciding who's going to more efficiently deal with what. That it's fundamentally about love, actually, and our Christian vocation to care for each other. So that's the argument that I'm making in this paper. One of the things that I point to. So the paper is divided up into three different. I will say that I should maybe also, by way of preface, this is called intercultural exchange. I think that was initially another panel discussion. Yeah. So in case you were wondering how this is all, I think it fits. But I gather that some things didn't quite work out. So you're in for a treat. Trust me. On this, and I think it's connected because the example that I use to talk about subsidiarity is refugee resettlement, and Canada's refugee resettlement program, and how it actually manifests, and how it's a really good example of Catholic social teaching working in the real world. So hopefully that will tie in somehow with what you thought you were here for.
I love this. Unexpected.
Yeah.
How about you?
Yeah. Well, it keeps things interesting. So just to summarize, just so we're all on the same page, subsidiarity is often described as the principle. So first of all, it's one of the four fundamental principles of Catholic social teaching, along with human dignity, the common good, and solidarity. And I think those are all tied together, and I think it's shown in our refugee program. But subsidiarity specifically is usually talked about as delegating down to the closest level, closest to the individual as possible. And except insofar as it can't be dealt with at that low level, in which case it comes to a higher order of authority. And I think that's a decent definition, but it's actually not the original one that Pope Pius XI brought out. And so, if you want to follow along, it's on page 7, at the top of page 7. Pope Pius XI actually introduces the principle with this quote. He says, "Just as it is gravely wrong to take from individuals what they can accomplish by their own initiative and industry and give it to the community, so also it is an injustice and at the same time a grave evil and disturbance of right order to assign to a greater and higher association what lesser and subordinate organizations can do. For every social activity ought of its very nature to furnish help to the members of the body social and never destroy and absorb them." So I think what I was saying earlier about sometimes when people think of the principle of subsidiarity, sometimes when people think of the principle of subsidiarity, they think, well, let's be more efficient to deliver, a certain program, be more efficient to collect garbage at the municipal government level, be more efficient to raise children in a family. Those are all true. But it's not the fundamental reason, because I think if you look at the Pope's wording here, this is something which is, like, he talks about gravely wrong and a disturbance of right order and a grave evil. These are not things, this is not the language you associate with efficiency. This is the language you associate with something with a moral weight to it. So what is it about this principle that is so weighty from a moral perspective? And I think, again, that's what I think our refugee program highlights. So, I want to get into what Canada's refugee program looks like. Canada resettles thousands of refugees every year, tens of thousands of refugees every year, and it does so through two streams. There is a government-assisted refugee stream, which is brought in, identified by usually the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and then they come to Canada and they're assisted by government. So government contracts out to settlement agencies, and those settlement agencies then are the ones primarily responsible for resettling those refugees. But Canada is also the first country in the world to, starting in the 1970s, have a privately sponsored refugee program alongside the government-assisted refugee program. And so that's been going on for decades. And in that case, what happens is the government is, or the government is responsible for doing security checks and that kind of thing, but it is ultimately churches or diaspora community organizations or these kinds of community groups, sometimes even just groups of individuals in Canada. They're the ones who actually do the work of resettling refugees. And so some of your parishes may probably even do some of that work already with the Refugee Committee. That's the kind of private sponsorship that we're talking about. There are a few others, like there's blended visa office refugees, which kind of combine those two things. But for the most part, it's those two, government-assisted refugees and privately sponsored refugees. Now, because it's been going on since the 1970s, we have decades and decades of research that has been done on how the two groups integrate on average. And luckily, they both do pretty well, but it's consistently shown that privately sponsored refugees tend to integrate better than government-assisted refugees. So if you want to take a look at some real data, I would normally have it on the screen. But take a look at page 13. For Syrian, so right after the Trudeau government was elected in 2015, of course they had a very high-profile promise to bring 25,000 refugees from Syria to Canada. So this was a survey that was done, figure 2. You can see that the privately sponsored refugees in yellow, by the time of this survey, 53% of them have already found a job. 10% of the government-assisted refugees have done so. Now, I'm not saying that economic integration is the only thing that matters, I'm not, but I think this is a pretty clear indication of how at least this group of refugees have been integrated into Canada. Figure 3 shows what their plans were, how many of them were currently looking for work, how many of them were not looking for work, but plan to do so in the future. And there you can see again, I think that of those who are not working, a greater percentage of the privately sponsored refugees were looking for work. And there are some reasons for that, I think. If you look at page 15, by the way, throughout this entire report, the yellow represents privately sponsored refugees, and the red represents government-assisted refugees. So you can see here again, this is about annual earnings over time. So you can see right off the bat, privately sponsored refugees have higher incomes on average than government-assisted refugees. It does narrow over time. So over time, that advantage kind of starts to disappear. But nonetheless, it's real, especially in the early years when someone first comes to Canada. And then page 16, if you look at figure 5, it shows basically the same thing. That privately sponsored refugees tend to do much better, especially in the early years, than what's called GARs, so government-assisted refugees. So this is not data that Cardus compiled. This is Statistics Canada data. But what we did is we tried to take all of that data and put it into one place, and then we started looking at why people think that this is the case, and they point to a lot of things. They point to the fact that privately sponsored refugees tend to get much more personalized assistance because there's a community of people there. The other thing that a lot of people say is that PSR is automatically welcomed into a community. So it's usually the parish or the church that sponsored them. Or if it was a diaspora community organization, they're automatically welcomed into a cultural organization of a culture that they know and understand while they're being integrated into Canada. There are some other reasons, but I think the point that I wanted to draw in this paper was that this all points to one thing. This points to the idea that when you have a local community that is organizing this kind of a social program, they tend to do better. They tend to do it better than when the government does. Which doesn't say the government's doing it poorly necessarily, but it does say that the private organization is doing it better. And the question then is why? And I would say that the fundamental insight that I think we should draw from this is that when the brilliance of Canada's refugee program is that it puts the power into the hands of individual people so that they can choose. They're choosing of their own free will to participate in refugee resettlement. They're actually choosing in some cases who's coming to Canada, and in many cases it's family reunification, but not always. But the point is, because they're choosing out of a self-sacrificial love to bring someone to Canada and resettle them here, it has a different character than when a government does it or when a settlement agency worker does it. That doesn't mean that the settlement agency worker is not doing excellent work or doing it out of a strong sense of solidarity as well. But there is a different character when something's done in the private sphere for someone that they know. And that is, I think, the brilliance of the refugee program. That's ultimately, fundamentally, I think, to bring it back to subsidiarity, that's what the principle of subsidiarity is reminding us of. That it's not just about delegating down to the local level for efficiency's sake. Not at all. What it is that it's delegating down to the local level because that's where community is actually built. That's where where bonds of love are actually formed. And it's those bonds of love that build our community and then support those people coming into it. I would just bring you to page 22, if you don't mind. And this is where I think it really highlights the importance of this principle of subsidiarity that we have. Because I think you can see subsidiarity shining through in these quotes from these academic. These are the two indented quotes that you can see are quotes from academic sources that had done surveys, and this is what they say. Settlement workers may be assigned to many government-assisted refugees and must serve them equally and without preferential treatment. They are public actors subject to public norms of neutrality. Refugee sponsors are avowedly partial. They feel a unique commitment to advance the welfare of the specific family they sponsor, or as many sponsors say, our family. This too echoes the particularity of kinship relations. And then I'll go down a little further. There is a certain paradox in this. Some refugee sponsors may be motivated to welcome the stranger by humanitarian ethos that regards human beings as equal in their suffering and equally entitled to aid in relief of suffering. Yet refugee sponsorship trades on formation of thick bonds that connect specific sponsors to specific refugees, despite the aleatory circumstances of the initial match that brought them together. Sponsors are thus expected to care more about the welfare of the family they sponsor than about refugees. So I think there's a few key words in there. Specifically care, you know? And I think that's the fundamental point I think that we often forget about as Catholics, is that our principle of subsidiarity, this one that we barely understand, is actually fundamentally about care. It's not about efficiency, it's about care and love. And it's by delegating down to the local level, to the family, to local organizations, to parishes, that we allow that care to actually take place in a way that can't exist at a higher level as much. So that's really what I wanted to say, and I'd love to hear your challenges to it or your thoughts, if there are any. Or Miles, you also may have some.
Well, no, I mean, I have some in my pocket, but I think if there are already questions from the floor, I'd be very happy to give priority to those.
I'll start with one. I don't want to get too wonky with it, but I see it's actually your concluding section here, which is how to apply this lens to other areas of public policy. Child care is one example, where we've kind of smothered, actually, and really harmed the delivery of that. It's really easier said than done. It seems to work well in this circumstance, but then when you try to do this, say in healthcare or social services delivery, like how do you do it effectively? It's one thing to devolve it to the jurisdiction But I think, having those market principles and also the choice and the care of, individual actors in small communities to help with the service delivery, it translates well in certain areas and it doesn't in others, and governments kind of struggle to do this well, generally, I think it's fair to say, so.
Yeah, so one thing I think is important to note is like subsidiarity is a very flexible principle in a way. Like it's the basic idea is that there's all these institutions in society. They all ought to have different powers and authorities, assigned to them. But which one? I think which institution should have it is not always clear. And I think that takes a lot of practical judgment on the part of policymakers to figure out when they should intervene and when they should not, and so practical judgment is a tricky thing because it's like taking theory and applying it to on-the-ground reality. So I think my own view of this is it's not always going to be clear, and so what it takes is for people in government positions to start looking at things through a subsidiarity lens, and to start having a subsidiarity mentality. Because too often, I think sometimes the automatic reaction of the government is we ought to do something, and there are a lot of cases where we do, as governments have to do something, but there are other cases where actually the solution might be just hold off for a bit and let the community figure out a solution. But the first, it's a mindset shift, that needs to happen, because unfortunately our politics plays a role in this too. Sometimes governments are too quickly criticized when something happens. It's actually not their fault. And so they figure they need to come in with a regulation or something like that.
Yeah.
And so anyway,
I was just going to use one example. We've talked about this before, and how that plays out, the politics of it and the responsibility and the difficulties. Delivery of social programming, particularly for vulnerable persons, people in the justice system. So the tendency is to formalize the relationship with a transfer payment, become devolve the responsibility on this entity so that they can be responsible for the care of and rehabilitation of offenders, for example. And the outcomes are really bad, generally. Like they don't really work that well. They have very targeted interventions. It's often because there's a lack of this care and involvement and investment over time, connection to the labor market. And so, but you see entities who do that well, parishes and groups that provide training and then ongoing connections to employment opportunities, they have much better results. But there's a whole bureaucracy. I think it's the politics I want to emphasize. There's a whole bureaucracy around organizations who have been built up and developed through direct payments to provide these services, I think, are of very poor quality ultimately. And there are very few areas, I think, of government policy where it's not primarily the former approach. This is a standout to me, and I think it's the politics, because there's an ecosystem of entities that are they owe their existence basically to direct transfer payments from government. Anyway, that's just my
That's a good comment. I guess I think with subsidiarity also, because it kind of recognizes society as a multi-layered thing. It's not just the individual, it's not just the state. There's all these other institutions that exist in between these two things. It also means that the solution to something is never going to be just one Like, it's never going to be
Yes.
just the state that's going to come in and do something. Neither really is it always going to be just the church doing something. It's not just, or just the hospital doing something. In fact, it's going to be a whole, if you talk about an ecosystem of institutions working together in their own domain. So when it comes to offender reintegration, for people leaving prison, which you were talking about, Peter, I think we just have to recognize what it's going to take. So in the research I did on that topic, it's really interesting to see that one of the things that drives people into crime often is a broken family life in their youth, not surprisingly. But what's going to bring them out of crime when they leave prison? I'd like to say it would be a strong family, but that may not be an option for many people. So you have to do something else, which is employment. And employment is another another kind of community that's going to help support people. So it's all these different institutions doing their own different thing in these unique circumstances, which no government, I think, can fully comprehend each individual person's life, which is why you need all these smaller institutions that can tailor responses to the individual circumstances. And I think, again, because we're trading on care, we're trading on these relationships of people who actually know the person and who care about them in a way.
So I think for me, more of a comment than anything else.
Sure.
And I'll preface it by saying that I work for the Sisters of St. Joseph as their apology advocate in their ministry for social justice, peace, and creation for a very long time. I didn't know it. And I think there are cautionary examples as well as great actionable examples when we look back at the history of models that could be argued as forms of subsidiarity. So the first thing that comes to mind as a cautionary tale are the residential schools here in Canada, right? That was a federal thing that they parceled out to smaller organizations, mostly Christian, with this sort of mission idea. But the reason I bring it up is simply the action of, we have this policy that we want to follow through with, we have these good ideas about it, and we're going to parcel it out to these smaller agencies to take care of, and 150 years later we see where we're at with that. So that would be my cautionary example of something that if subsidiarity and solidarity are not equally partnered with the other elements of Catholic social teaching, we can still run into some very bad outcomes. The flip side of that, I think, are when you look at so many of the religious institutions, including the one that I work for, where they have founded the schools and the hospitals and different organizations that to this day are still institutions for the public good, and those are good examples. Those are the success stories, if you will, of where that community of care paired with the solidarity and subsidiarity can lead to healthier legacies. But I think the point I was trying to make is that if we're not pairing, as you say, it's not just this thing alone.
Yeah.
And we don't have to look far for examples of where they've gone good and where they've not.
Yeah, so I agree with your broad point, about there need to be a unity of all principles, 100%. In fact, that's I think one of the points. The point of the paper is called Bonds of Solidarity because that's I think the goal of subsidiarity. In fact, I call it. There's a section there. I think it's Subsidiarity and Solidarity: Two Principles of Care. I think you're right to highlight a potential danger with subsidiarity, which is like when it gets unhitched from solidarity. By the way, the same is true with solidarity, when that can get unhitched from subsidiarity, because they're potentially going in opposite directions. Subsidiarity is a movement, more local in a way, closer to the individual, and solidarity is a movement closer to the totality, in the sense that we're recognizing the solidarity of the whole human family ultimately. So I see the two as mutually reinforcing, but also mutually constraining in a way. So I forget where I heard this, but they say subsidiarity without solidarity is radical individualism, and solidarity without subsidiarity is actually radical collectivism. And one of the things that we talk about a lot in Catholic social teaching and Catholic theology more broadly is both and, right? We constantly talk about both and. So it's always about the individual and the collective, and what that actually is community. So it's the person in society and is community, and that's ultimately what we want to be thinking of. It's how does that person contribute to the common good, so I agree with your caution. What I would say is yeah, I think properly understood. The other thing I think is that subsidiarity properly understood. It's not always correctly understood. It contains the principle of solidarity, and vice versa. Solidarity contains the principle of subsidiarity in this person and community idea. But for sure, the unity. I think the unity of the two, and I think if we understood them as united, I think we would not have run into the problems that we would have seen that we had in Canada in residential schools and in other places, because it's ultimately about recognizing the dignity of every human person.
I like that nuance of that idea of the interplay between the two, and I don't know who said that or where that came from, but I really like that.
Sounds like something you would have said.
But I had a couple of thoughts. One anecdote, a close friend of mine founded one of the Toronto Catholic worker communities. And the Catholic worker tradition coming out of the United States was very much against the impersonalism of Holy Mother State versus the personalism of and so lived a life of radical hospitality, a house of hospitality, an ultimate particularity, not just like a church welcoming a refugee, but come and live in my home with me, you who are broken and in need, that kind of level of to then years later eventually and is now a social worker in a social service agency. And it's really interesting to talk to him about the difference of the experience of being a professional social worker and a Catholic worker, and those two experiences, and it's interesting to bet, because what can come, I see, is the particularity is the bond, but also the right to rejection. So as a professional, like you said, you have to, according to the conduct of your profession, you must, follow these standards, treat people in this way. As an individual, I almost equally have, other than how you feel, it's bound by your faith maybe, but you are not bound by any sexual conduct. So just as easily as I can accept you and bring you in and bond with you and have that bond in that personal way, I can equally cast you out, right, and put you aside and forget about you. And that was, so his reflection that way was kind of, and also the notion of boundaries as well too. And I see that not so much in our own church's experience with working with refugees, but listen to other experiences as well too. The challenge of boundaries as well too, where to a certain extent, I think boundaries are important for well-being often, and there is often, I think, a higher risk, for better or for worse, right? when boundaries are less clear, you have also the potential of very deeper bonding, deeper positive outcomes, but you also have the potential of negative outcomes as well too. So I found that listening to him and that experience, and he wasn't saying Catholic worker was bad and now I'm doing, now it's good. a very interesting kind of reflection that kind of touches on some of those themes. The other thing I was thinking about is, I find with subsidiarity, it's interesting where within how political perspectives, left-wing and right-wing, come to the principle of subsidiarity, and it's because really I think, well, what is it, subsidium is like relief, help, right? Like, so the idea, and it should be that interplay, as you're saying, it's not, it actually isn't just the idea that it's one directional down to the lowest level, and it's always going in both directions, and the difficulty is the judgment in knowing when. So when is it appropriate that the government needs to be involved and step in and provide the help, the support, the structure that cannot be provided by, and it's even, I think it's maybe even less helpful to think of it in terms of like government versus private, but orders of society or levels of organization. So from a family unit to, I don't know, a civic association of families or a neighborhood association to governments, or to like there's the different, and when is it appropriate? That's a hard question, right? Because you might have one group of people who says, subsidium is needed in this case, it's necessary, and then another group looking at the same situation who would say it is not needed, it's the grave violation, right? That's the dialogue and the encounter and the nuance in sorting out, all coming from the same place, the same idea that we believe, that higher order should only intervene or provide it in so much as the lower order, again, not avoiding categories of private and public or government and church or whatever, but should only intervene to the degree to which it is necessary because the lower order cannot or is unable to. So it's like all things. I guess it's a dance. I don't know. And it's interesting to see how that dance gets played out across political ideologies as well too. Right?
Yeah, there's so much there. In what you said, I agree with it's a dance. I never thought of it as a dance, but I think it is. Our Protestant brothers and sisters have a different concept of sphere sovereignty, which is related very much to
Sphere sovereignty.
Sphere sovereignty.
Sphere or sphere?
Sphere.
I really want to make sure I heard
Especially in sort of Dutch Reform, Neo-Kuyperian, Nooivaart school guys, that you'll hear that phrase a lot.
Yeah.
And Catholics, I think, are just getting up to speed are actually sometimes get bootstrapped by what they learned from the Dutch Reform common good guys.
Well, and so the idea is that society is made up of all these different spheres, right? So there's the educational sphere, there's the political sphere, there's all these, and sometimes I don't know why I'm talking about this exactly, but I do. What they'll say is that, well, how do the spheres interact? Because they're sovereign within their own sphere, but how do they interact? Because there always has to be interaction. And there has to be a lot of pushback sometimes. Like if one sphere is over encroaching into another, then it's incumbent upon that other sphere to kind of fight back a little bit. And I think that's a bit of a, not fight back, because that's the wrong terminology.
There are ecological processes that describe this, right? Symbiosis or parasitism or whatever.
Oh, there you go. That's an interesting parallel.
Yeah.
But the point is that sometimes, and I think sometimes they have to kind of push back a little bit to make sure that the spheres are aligned. And I think the same thing kind of happens in subsidiarity. It's a little bit more hierarchical, I suppose, but if it feels like one part of one layer of our society is getting a little too powerful, well, sometimes maybe the lower authority needs to push back, or vice versa. But I think that the key to understanding subsidiarity is, well, a key to understanding subsidiarity is it's about an attitude of help. Like you said, subsidium. It means support or reserve troops. Who are there to help the people. And I think if people if each institution thought of their role as how am I going to help that other institution thrive, that's a completely different way of thinking about our society. That's not how we think about it now. It's competitive, you know, anyway, like that, it goes into labor relations too, because in North America, we think of employers and labor as constantly at loggerheads, and necessarily so, but there are other models out there which is actually a more cooperative approach to labor relations, and I think an attitude of help is relevant there. If governments also, I think when governments come in and they say, I need to fix this problem, it's usually because of a political imperative, and they're not necessarily thinking, how am I going to help someone else to solve this problem? I'm just going to solve it myself, you know? But that might be too much exercise of power, and it would be more rightly ordered for them to say, what can I do to help this institution figure it out for themselves, which is probably also going to lead to a more sustainable result. So anyway, thank you for bringing up Subsidia. That was a really important point. Yeah.
We burned through our time very, very quickly. So 7 minutes until the next session. So what I was thinking is this conversation might carry on offline during the break, but for those who need to grab a coffee for the next break, I was thinking we would adjourn the formal side of it. And before we did that, I just hope you would all join me in thanking Renza for driving a provocative conversation that started many different perspectives.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for doing that.